There is a story so rarely spoken, its details seem more rumor than truth, more shadow than substance. It starts, as many do, with a house, a structure that, to the passing eye, is just another remnant of time. Boards cracked with age, windows clouded by grime, the kind of place children dare each other to approach but never enter. But those who know, they warn you to stay far away. Not because of the creaking wood or the whispers of wind that seep through broken panes. No, they warn you because of what the house holds inside. For as long as anyone can remember, stories have surrounded the house. Stories of reflections that aren't quite right. Of mirrors that seem alive, watching you, waiting for something. It's said that once, long ago, a family moved into the house. People in the town never saw them leave. The only thing left behind was their belongings, and a mirror. A mirror no one dared take with them. In time, the house was left to decay, forgotten by most. But the stories lingered. Stories of people who grew curious. People who stepped inside and found themselves standing in front of that mirror. People who thought they were alone, until they realized the reflection staring back wasn't theirs. They say it doesn't happen all at once. At first you think it's nothing. A trick of the light, perhaps. But then you notice it, the small things. The way your reflection lingers a moment too long after you've turned away. The way it smiles when you're not smiling. And then, when it's too late, you realize the reflection is no longer trapped in the glass. Some call it a curse. Others call it something worse. But those who know its story all agree on one thing. If you value your soul, you'll never look too long into the mirror. Tonight we tell the story of the mirror house. Not just the story of what happened there, but of the ones who didn't listen. It begins in a town forgotten by most. A place where time seems to move slower, where life feels quieter, and where shadows linger just a little longer than they should. This town, barely a dot on any map, holds no grand claim to history. Its streets are lined with faded storefronts, their signs bleached by years of sun and rain. The kind of place where strangers are noticed, where everyone knows everyone, and everyone knows to stay away from one particular corner of the town. At the edge of an overgrown field, hidden by rows of gnarled trees, stands the house. It doesn't beckon you, not in the way stories often describe haunted places. Instead, it seems to watch you. Its windows, smeared with dirt and shadowed by cracked shutters, feel like eyes, cold, unblinking and full of judgment. The roof slants precariously, its shingles warped and broken, yet somehow the house refuses to collapse. It's as if something is holding it together, something unwilling to let it fall. The path leading to the house is almost invisible now, swallowed by weeds and tangled roots. Few dare approach, and those who do say the air changes as you draw closer. It grows heavier, harder to breathe, carrying with it a faint, unplaceable scent, something damp and metallic like rusted iron left too long in the rain. The closer you get, the more you feel it. A weight in your chest. A sense that you're being watched, though no one is there. The house has stood here for over a century, its origins shrouded in mystery. Some say it was built by a reclusive man with wealth far beyond what anyone in the town could fathom. Others say it was a retreat for a family fleeing their own dark past. The truth? No one knows for sure. The only thing they know is the house's history is marked by tragedy. The first family to live there vanished without a trace. A family of 4, their belongings left behind as if they had merely stepped out for the day. Plates still on the table, beds still made. But they never returned. The sheriff at the time organized a search, but it led nowhere. It was as though the earth itself had swallowed them whole. Years later, another family moved in. The town watched from a distance, curious but cautious. For months nothing happened. Then, slowly, whispers began to spread. A child in the family had told a friend at school that the mirrors in the house weren't normal. That sometimes when you walked past they showed things they shouldn't. The child said she saw herself in the mirror, but it wasn't her. It was someone else, someone with her face but different eyes. Not long after, the family left in the dead of night, abandoning the house just as suddenly as the first. The town breathed a collective sigh of relief, but they knew better than to touch the house. It was left to the elements, though nature seemed reluctant to reclaim it. Even now it stands as it always has. The windows cracked but not shattered. The walls warped but not broken. And inside they say the mirrors remain. Untouched. Waiting. Those brave, or foolish, enough to approach the house speak of the sounds they hear. Faint whispers carried on the wind, though there's no one around. The creak of footsteps on wooden floors, though the house is empty. And sometimes, just sometimes, they say you can hear a faint knocking, as if someone is tapping gently from the other side of the mirrors. The house has no official name, but the townsfolk gave it one. They call it the Mirror House. Not because of its grandeur or its age, but because of what it holds inside. A place that seems alive, feeding on the curiosity of those who dare to enter. A place where reflections don't just mimic you, they watch you. But the house isn't the only thing with a story. There's one mirror inside larger than the rest, sitting in the main hall. They say that's where it all began. And once you see yourself in it, you'll never see yourself the same way again. Every story needs someone willing or desperate enough to uncover the truth. For this story, that person is Sarah Green. Sarah isn't the kind of person who scares easily. She's a journalist by trade, the kind of journalist who doesn't just tell stories, she lives them. Her career has been built on exploring the strange and unexplained, forgotten tragedies, whispered legends, and the kind of mysteries that most people avoid out of fear or superstition. But for Sarah, it's never just been about curiosity. Her fascination with the unknown started years ago, on the day her world fell apart. She was only 16 when her younger sister, Emily, vanished. It happened on an ordinary summer afternoon. Emily had been playing in the backyard while Sarah worked on a school project inside. It wasn't until dinner that their mother realized Emily was gone. The search lasted for months. Police combed the woods, dredged the rivers, questioned neighbors, and even brought in search dogs. But there was nothing. No trail, no witnesses. Just a quiet, haunting absence that settled over their family like a shadow. The worst part wasn't the not knowing, it was the whispers. People in town speculated. Some said Emily had run away. Others suggested something darker, something unspeakable. Sarah couldn't stand the rumors, and she couldn't stand the silence that followed when the search was called off. She spent years replaying that day in her mind, wondering what she had missed, what more she could have done. That loss shaped Sarah in ways she couldn't fully understand. It left her with questions she couldn't stop asking. Questions about the world, about the unseen forces that seem to shape our lives, and about the things we tell ourselves to make sense of the inexplicable. Over time, her search for answers became her career. She built a reputation as a fearless investigator, someone willing to chase the truth no matter how dark or uncomfortable it might be. She exposed fraudulent psychics, debunked paranormal hoaxes, and unraveled the threads of long-forgotten mysteries. But there was one story she avoided. One legend she refused to touch, even as it lingered at the edge of her mind. The legend of the Mirror House. Sarah had heard about the house years ago during her first big assignment. She was interviewing townsfolk about a series of unexplained disappearances when an old man mentioned it in passing. "If you're looking for strange," he'd said, "you should visit the Mirror House. That place swallows people whole." At the time, Sarah dismissed it. The house sounded like just another ghost story, the kind people tell to scare their children. But over the years she started to notice something. The house kept coming up, whispered about in the background of unrelated cases. A missing person here, a sudden tragedy there. Somehow the Mirror House always seemed connected. Still, Sarah stayed away. Until now. Her decision to investigate wasn't made lightly. In fact, it wasn't her decision at all. It started with a letter, slipped under her office door late one night. The paper was yellowed, the handwriting shaky but deliberate. The message was short and to the point. "If you want to know what happened to your sister, come to the house. Midnight. Bring no one." For days, Sarah stared at the letter, her mind racing with possibilities. Was it a cruel prank? A trap? Or could it be something else, something real? She wanted to ignore it, to brush it off as some sick joke. But the part of her that had never stopped searching for Emily wouldn't let her. And so, against her better judgment, she packed a bag, grabbed her camera, and drove to the small, nameless town where the house waited. She told no one where she was going, not even her editor. As she approached the house, she felt a familiar mix of dread and determination. She wasn't just chasing another story. She was chasing closure. But Sarah wasn't the only one with a story. The house had a history of its own, and its history was about to collide with hers in ways she could never have imagined. The house stood before her like a monument to everything she feared and everything she couldn't ignore. Its weathered facade loomed tall against the evening sky, its once grand structure now cloaked in decay. The iron gate, heavy with rust, groaned in protest as Sarah pushed it open. Each step she took along the overgrown pathway felt deliberate, as if the house itself was waiting to welcome her, or to trap her. The front door, a massive slab of dark wood, was slightly ajar, creaking softly as the wind teased its edges. Sarah hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She had walked into countless abandoned buildings before, but this was different. The air felt thicker here, carrying with it the faint scent of mildew and something faintly metallic. She stepped inside. The first thing she noticed was the cold. It wasn't the kind of chill that came from drafts or poor insulation. It was a pervasive, bone-deep cold that seemed to seep into her very core. The kind of cold that made her question whether she'd ever felt warmth at all. Her flashlight beam swept across the room, revealing furniture draped in white sheets that looked more like ghosts frozen mid-motion. Cobwebs clung to the corners of the high ceilings, and dust danced in the air like restless spirits. A grand chandelier hung above, its crystals clouded and dull, swaying gently though there was no breeze. Sarah's footsteps echoed on the wooden floorboards, each creak sounding louder than the last. She began to narrate into her recorder, her voice steady despite the unease tightening her chest. "I've entered what locals call the mirror house. First impressions? Decayed, abandoned, and yet, it feels alive in a way that's hard to explain." Her words trailed off as her flashlight illuminated a mirror hanging on the far wall. It was unlike any she'd seen before, tall, ornate, its gilded frame covered in intricate carvings that seemed to shift under the flickering light. She approached it cautiously, her reflection growing clearer with each step. But something about the image felt off. Her reflection moved as she did, yet it seemed slower, lagging by just a fraction of a second. Sarah shook her head and laughed nervously, chalking it up to her imagination. But as she turned away, she could have sworn she saw her reflection linger for just a moment longer, watching her leave. She moved deeper into the house, her senses on high alert. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional groan of the old structure settling. She entered what appeared to be a sitting room, its walls lined with faded wallpaper and shelves filled with books that looked as though they hadn't been touched in decades. On a small table by the fireplace she found a journal. Its leather cover was cracked and worn, but the pages inside were surprisingly intact. The handwriting was meticulous, every letter perfectly formed. It belonged to the house's original owner, a man named Elias Hawthorne. Sarah flipped through the pages, her breath catching as she read. The entries began innocuously enough. Accounts of daily life, musings on the weather, notes about dinner parties. But as she turned the pages, the tone shifted. The entries became darker, filled with ramblings about the mirrors in the house. "They don't just reflect," one entry read. "They watch. They remember." Another entry was more frantic. "Do not look into them after midnight. That is when they are strongest. That is when they show you what you fear most." A loud creak interrupted her reading and she whipped around, her flashlight scanning the room. There was no one there, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Her skin prickled as she caught sight of another mirror, this one smaller and resting on a nearby dresser. She approached it cautiously, her breath fogging the glass as she leaned in. At first she saw nothing unusual. But then a faint shadow moved across the surface, inside the mirror, not in the room. Sarah stepped back, her heart pounding. She tried to rationalize it, telling herself it was just a trick of the light. But deep down she knew better. She decided to record her thoughts again. "The journals speak of strange occurrences involving the mirrors, but I'm not sure if it's hysteria or something more. I'm beginning to understand why the locals are so afraid of this place." As she moved toward the staircase, the air grew colder still. Her flashlight flickered, the beam cutting in and out, casting erratic shadows on the walls. The steps creaked under her weight as she ascended, each sound echoing into the dark void above. On the second floor, she found herself in a long hallway lined with mirrors of all shapes and sizes. Oval, rectangular, ornate, simple, they covered the walls like a gallery of distorted memories. She felt their presence as she walked past, as though 1,000 unseen eyes were following her every move. The door at the end of the hallway was slightly ajar, and Sarah hesitated before pushing it open. Inside was what appeared to be a child's room. The wallpaper was faded but still bore the cheerful pattern of stars and moons. A small bed sat in the corner, its covers neatly arranged as if waiting for someone to return. On the dresser sat yet another mirror, this one cracked, the jagged lines splitting her reflection into fragments. Sarah approached it, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch the glass. For a moment she thought she saw a face behind her own, a pale, hollow-eyed face staring back at her. She spun around, but the room was empty. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper as she spoke into the recorder. "Something is very wrong here. The mirrors, they're not just objects. I don't know what they are, but they're not normal." Little did Sarah know, the house was only beginning to reveal its secrets. Sarah pushed open the heavy door of the mansion, the hinges groaning under the weight of centuries of neglect. Her heart skipped a beat as the dark interior unfolded before her, the faint, flickering light from her flashlight casting strange, distorted shadows on the walls. There was no immediate sound, no creak of floorboards or rustle of leaves, just the silence that came from abandonment. But that silence felt wrong. It wasn't peaceful. It was as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. She stepped inside, feeling the temperature drop as if the air had been chilled deliberately. The entryway was vast, with a high ceiling that seemed to stretch into the blackness above. The floor was covered with a thick layer of dust, undisturbed for who knows how many years. It was as if the house had been frozen in time, holding on to its secrets, refusing to let them go. Her flashlight flickered again, casting an eerie glow across the room. She swiped the beam to the left, illuminating a grand staircase that curved upward into the unknown. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, peeling in places, revealing the rotting wood beneath. An ancient chandelier hung above, its once shining crystals now covered in grime. The air smelled stale, heavy with decay. She inhaled slowly, forcing herself to calm her racing pulse. The kind of air that clung to your lungs, weighing you down. The house had an oppressive atmosphere. Every corner seemed to hold something just out of sight, just beyond the light. Every whisper of wind that rattled the cracked windows felt like a warning, urging her to turn back. But she couldn't. She was already too deep. She had to know. With each step, the floor groaned, the house protesting against her intrusion. As Sarah moved further inside, she found herself unable to shake the feeling that she was not alone. The walls seemed to close in, the vast, open space of the entryway now feeling narrow and suffocating. She glanced back at the door, now seemingly too far away to return to so easily. Suddenly, a loud creak echoed from the far side of the room, like the sound of a door opening. Sarah froze, her flashlight beam shifting toward the source. Nothing. She swallowed hard, chalking it up to the house's age, but the unease lingered like a heavy fog. "This is ridiculous," she muttered under her breath, trying to convince herself. "There's nothing here." But even as she said it, the words felt hollow. The house was too still, too quiet, and that silence was beginning to grate on her nerves. She reached for the old journal she had found earlier, hoping that reading the eerie entries might ground her. Her fingers brushed the worn leather, sending a shiver down her spine. The handwriting was elegant but erratic, as though written in a hurry. The first few pages were filled with mundane accounts of daily life. Morning fog, the rustle of trees in the distance, dinner parties attended. But as Sarah turned the pages, the tone shifted. The entries became more frantic. "They are here again," one entry read. "The mirrors are watching. I feel them staring even when I'm not near them." Another passage was even more disturbing. "It's not just a reflection. It's them. The ones who are trapped in the glass. They're trying to communicate, trying to reach out." Sarah felt a chill settle in her bones as she read. She flipped through more pages, her eyes scanning the words. The further she went, the more desperate the entries became. "Don't look into them after midnight. That is when they are at their strongest," one entry warned. A sense of foreboding washed over her as she read the words aloud to herself. "What are you trying to tell me, Elias?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath. She glanced around the room, expecting to feel the weight of the house's secrets pressing in on her. But everything was still. But the stillness was only an illusion. As she moved toward the next room, she could feel it, something behind her. The unmistakable sensation of being watched. She spun around, her flashlight cutting through the dark, but there was nothing. Nothing but the dusty air and the creaking of the old house. She gripped the journal tightly in her hands as she entered the next room. It was a sitting room, or what had once been one. The furniture had been covered with faded sheets, as though they were ghosts, lingering in the past. In one corner, an old mirror stood, its glass slightly fogged over with age. The reflection was murky, distorted, like a dream on the edge of memory. She approached it, her heartbeat loud in her ears. As she stared into the surface, she could see her own reflection staring back at her, but it wasn't quite right. Her image was sharp, too sharp, as though it was waiting for her to make the next move. Sarah hesitated. The air around her seemed to thicken, each breath coming with a heavy sense of dread. She took a step back. For a brief moment, she thought she saw something in the reflection, someone standing behind her. Her heart leapt in her chest and she spun around. There was nothing. But when she looked back at the mirror, her reflection was different. The eyes staring back at her were deeper. Hollow. They seemed to stare right through her, as though something else was looking at her from within. A rush of unease filled her, and she quickly turned away, clutching the journal to her chest. She walked deeper into the house, trying to ignore the feeling that something was closing in on her, following her every move. The deeper she went, the more uncomfortable she became. The mirrors were everywhere now. Each room seemed to have another, and with each one the sensation of being watched grew stronger. The hallway stretched on endlessly, lined with mirrors of varying shapes and sizes. Some were cracked, others cloudy with age, but they all held the same oppressive weight. She found herself unable to move past them. Each mirror seemed to pull her in, a silent invitation, a warning she couldn't quite understand. As she walked down the hallway, her eyes kept flicking back toward the nearest mirror, the feeling of unease growing with every step. Sarah's flashlight beam caught the reflection of her hand gripping the journal. It seemed to tremble, though she wasn't moving it. The room suddenly felt smaller, more claustrophobic. The walls seemed to close in as the hallway stretched on forever, an endless corridor of mirrors and shadows. Her fingers tightened on the flashlight as she hurried toward the stairs. The creaking of the wooden floorboards beneath her feet seemed to echo unnervingly through the silence. Each step was a countdown, but to what, she couldn't say. Finally, she reached the second floor, but the moment she set foot on the landing, the atmosphere seemed to change. The air was colder, heavier. And then she heard it, the faintest of sounds, like whispers carried on the breeze. But there was no breeze. No wind. Just the whispers growing louder. She spun around, feeling the sensation of being surrounded by invisible eyes, the whispers growing into an almost tangible presence. It was like the house itself was speaking to her, urging her to turn back. But Sarah was too deep now. She couldn't stop. Not when she was so close to the answers. With one last glance at the mirror-lined hallway, she pushed forward, determined to uncover the truth of this place, no matter what it took. As Sarah moved deeper into the house, the air seemed to grow denser, heavier. Each breath she took was laced with the faintest scent of decay. The silence that surrounded her was oppressive, smothering. She found herself in what appeared to be the drawing room, a once grand space now consumed by the weight of time. The once beautiful furniture was rotted and covered with thick dust, but what caught her attention was the mirrors. There was no escaping them. They lined every wall of the room, their surfaces grimy and cracked, as though time itself had fractured them. But Sarah couldn't tear her gaze away from them. Every mirror seemed to shift, its reflection just a little too perfect, too crisp. Her image looked different in each one, distorted like she was someone else entirely. At first it was subtle, almost unnoticeable. But the longer she stared into the glass, the more pronounced the changes became. Her reflection moved out of sync with her. Her hand, which she had placed on the arm of a chair, suddenly raised as though it had a mind of its own, fingers curling into a fist. It was small at first, just a flicker, a split second out of place. But then it grew. Her reflection seemed to be watching her, almost as if it was aware of her presence, waiting for her to make the next move. Her heart began to race as she stepped away from the mirror, the unease gnawing at her insides. It was impossible to look away, as though the mirrors were pulling at her, beckoning her closer. The whispers that had been a distant sound now came to the forefront of her consciousness. They were faint at first, like the murmurs of a crowd, and then they became sharper, more insistent. They seemed to echo from every direction, vibrating in her bones, surrounding her. The whispers weren't words yet. They were like fragments of forgotten thoughts, flickering in and out of existence. But with each step, the whispers grew clearer, louder, until they were impossible to ignore. Sarah's hands trembled as she fumbled to lift the flashlight again. The beam shook as it swept across the room, casting long, ghostly shadows across the floor. But it wasn't just the whispers that unsettled her. It was the feeling that someone, or something, was watching her. She spun around quickly, her flashlight cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. No movement. No sign of anything amiss. Still, she felt the weight of unseen eyes on her. The mirrors on the wall seemed to press in closer, each one reflecting a version of herself that wasn't quite right. She moved toward one on the far wall, her feet making no sound as she walked, as though the house itself was holding its breath. The mirror reflected the room behind her, but in it, her reflection wasn't standing where she was. It was standing in front of her. Her heart skipped a beat. Her reflection mirrored her movement, just like it should, but there was something unnerving about the way it moved. The reflection in the mirror was too smooth, too fluid. It wasn't just following her motions, it was anticipating them. And it wasn't her. At least not entirely. For a moment she stared in shock. Her reflection grinned, a slow, wicked smile spreading across its face. She jerked back, the sudden movement sending a shiver of horror up her spine. The grin in the mirror didn't fade, even as she took a step away. The whispers grew louder. They weren't coming from the mirrors anymore. They were coming from behind her. Suddenly she heard it, faint footsteps echoing from the floor above. They were soft, muffled, but they were unmistakable. Someone, or something, was moving through the house. Sarah's stomach twisted as she turned toward the stairs, dread rising in her chest. The sound stopped as quickly as it started, leaving only the heavy silence in its wake. Her mind raced. Could someone else be in the house with her? Had someone followed her in? But the answer didn't make sense. She was alone. She had come here alone. A loud, sudden bang came from behind her, as if something had crashed to the ground. Sarah jumped, her heart pounding in her chest. She spun around again only to find the room exactly as it had been before, silent, still, empty. Her breathing was shallow now, each inhale sharp and forced. As she walked toward the door that led deeper into the house, she noticed something strange, an old, weathered chair that seemed out of place. It was positioned right in front of the mirror she had just passed. But it wasn't the chair that caught her attention. It was the dark smudge on the floor near it. She knelt down, brushing away the dust, and her eyes widened when she saw what had caused the stain. It was a handprint. A clear, distinct handprint, its outline dark against the dirty floor as though someone, or something, had left it there not long ago. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she ran her fingers over the print, her mind racing. Was it fresh? Had someone been here recently? Or was it something else? Something more dangerous, more sinister? She stepped back quickly, her pulse racing as she surveyed the room once more. The whispers returned, louder now, almost as though they were urging her forward, calling to her, guiding her toward the door at the far end of the room. Every instinct told her to turn and run, to leave this place and never look back. But something kept her rooted to the spot. The mirror. That damn mirror. As if drawn by some unseen force, Sarah found herself moving toward it again. She didn't want to. She didn't think she could stop herself. Her body moved against her will, and before she could make sense of it, she was standing before the mirror once more. Her reflection was waiting. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at the reflection staring back at her. Only it wasn't just her. There, in the reflection, stood another figure, a person she didn't recognize. A woman, her face obscured by dark, tangled hair, her eyes hollow and unblinking. The woman reached out, her hand pressed against the glass, her fingers curling, beckoning Sarah to come closer. Frozen, unable to look away, Sarah's pulse quickened. She didn't know what to do. Every cell in her body screamed for her to move, to leave the room, but she couldn't tear herself away from the mirror. Suddenly, the woman in the reflection jerked forward, slamming her palms against the glass, her face contorting into a silent scream. Sarah stumbled backward, gasping for air. The mirror seemed to ripple, the glass warping as if it were alive. The reflection started to change, twisting, stretching, until it was no longer just a mirror. It became a window into something else. Something dark. Something that reached for her. The whispers grew louder, the voices from the past growing desperate, pleading. As the room seemed to close in around her, Sarah understood. She wasn't just trapped in the house. She was trapped in the mirrors. And now there was no way out. The air in the room felt like it was thickening, pressing against Sarah with an unbearable weight. Her heart raced as she tried to pull away from the mirror, but her feet felt as though they were glued to the floor. Every inch of her body screamed for her to turn and run, but the mirror held her there, like a prisoner bound by an invisible force. The whispers now weren't just whispers. They were sharp, urgent, demanding. They filled her ears, a cacophony of voices, faint, distorted, almost as though the mirror itself was alive and speaking to her, urging her to step closer. For a moment, everything seemed to still. The whispers faltered, the cold air holding its breath. In the reflection, Sarah saw herself, her body shaking, her expression a mix of fear and confusion, but it wasn't just her anymore. She wasn't alone. Behind her, the figure from the reflection stepped forward. A shadowy figure whose features were twisted, malformed. It was no longer a woman with dark hair, it was something worse, something wrong. Its body was hunched, its hands long and unnaturally stretched. Its face was a blur, as if the mirror couldn't even contain its true form. But the eyes were unmistakable. Cold, black as the void, staring directly at Sarah. The reflection seemed to leer at her, its mouth moving, but the words it spoke were lost in the thick fog of fear clouding Sarah's mind. The air around her seemed to darken, the shadows stretching longer and longer, swallowing the room until it felt like there was nowhere left to hide. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the reflection began to raise its hand, its fingers now pressing against the glass with unnatural force. The glass groaned, creaking as though it were under pressure, as though it was fighting to hold something back. Suddenly, the reflection's hand broke through. The glass cracked, the sound sharp like the breaking of bones. Sarah stumbled backward, eyes wide, her pulse thundering in her chest. She reached for the door, but it was too late. The figure from the mirror, no longer just a reflection, began to emerge from the shattered glass, its form warping and distorting with every step it took toward her. It wasn't just stepping out of the mirror anymore, it was flowing, leaking into the real world, its limbs stretching unnaturally, its body shifting and twitching like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. Sarah's mind reeled as she tried to process what she was seeing, but the terror was too much. She couldn't comprehend it. The figure was right in front of her now, its face just inches from hers, its eyes filled with a hunger that made her blood run cold. Sarah screamed. A scream that was swallowed by the suffocating silence of the house. The reflection in the mirror had stepped into the room, and now it was no longer a reflection. It was a presence, real, tangible, and terrifying. The room seemed to shift around her, the walls closing in, the air thick with a pressure that made it hard to breathe. She couldn't think, couldn't move. Every instinct in her screamed to run, but her legs refused to respond. The figure reached out with its long, crooked fingers, its hand grasping at her wrist, cold and clammy, its grip tightening. The touch felt like ice, like the deadest of graveyards. Sarah tried to pull away, but its hand only tightened, its fingers digging deeper into her skin. She could feel her pulse thudding against the pressure, each beat like a drum of impending doom. For a brief moment, Sarah managed to pull her wrist free, but it was no use. The figure, whatever it was relentless. It lunged forward, its face now mere inches from hers. The grotesque, stretched features twisted into a grimace of pure malice. A whisper, low, guttural, escaped its mouth, the words lost in the thick, suffocating air. And then it happened. A force like a violent gust of wind tore through the room. The air rushed past her, making her hair whip around her face, her clothes fluttering violently. The mirrors, the walls, the very foundation of the house seemed to shudder, as if the house itself were alive, trembling under the weight of the curse that bound it. The figure lunged, its hand grabbing hold of Sarah, pulling her forward with an inhuman strength. Her mind screamed, her vision blurred, and for a moment she thought she was going to be pulled into the mirror, swallowed whole by the darkness that lurked behind the glass. But in the split second before she was lost to it, something inside her snapped. A desperate, primal urge for survival surged through her veins. With all her strength, she broke free from the figure's grasp, staggering backward, her heart pounding in her ears. The mirror was still in front of her, its surface now trembling as though it too was alive, threatening to devour her whole. Without thinking, Sarah raised her arm, her hand gripping the nearest object, a heavy iron candlestick that had fallen to the floor earlier, and swung it at the mirror. The glass shattered with a deafening crack, the sound so sharp and final that it echoed through the entire house. For a moment the room fell silent. The figure, still caught within the shattered frame of the mirror, screamed, a high-pitched, blood-curdling wail that rattled Sarah's bones. The scream seemed to stretch on forever, reverberating through the walls, shaking the very air. But it wasn't just the figure that screamed. The house itself seemed to join in as though it were alive, mourning the loss of its prisoner. With one final, desperate lunge, Sarah turned and ran. Her legs carried her down the hallway, her breath ragged, her body trembling with fear and adrenaline. Behind her, she could hear the echoes of the screams slowly fading into nothingness, but the fear in her chest refused to subside. She had broken the mirror, but had she truly escaped? As she reached the door, the house seemed to groan as though it was mourning the figure's loss. The windows shook, the doors rattled, but Sarah pushed forward, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the handle. With a forceful pull, she threw the door open and ran out into the night. The cold air hit her like a slap, but she didn't stop. She didn't even look back. As she ran down the steps, the house loomed behind her, dark and silent. But in the quiet, she could feel it, an almost imperceptible weight like an invisible presence. Had she really escaped, or had something followed her out? The questions gnawed at her as she stumbled away, the sounds of the house growing quieter behind her. She didn't look back, but she could feel it. Something had changed. She had left the house, but the house hadn't left her. And neither had the curse. Sarah stumbled away from the mansion, her heart pounding, her chest heaving with each labored breath. Her legs, weakened from the terror that had gripped her, nearly gave way beneath her. The wind whipped through the trees, cold and biting, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Her feet carried her, though her mind felt clouded, each step a silent plea for escape. The air around her still felt thick with the weight of what had just transpired, as if something ancient, was watching her, waiting for her to falter. Her fingers gripped her flashlight so tightly that they ached, but the beam trembled in her hands, casting erratic shadows that danced unervingly around her. The mansion loomed in the distance, shrouded in fog, its broken windows like hollow eyes staring after her. The house was no longer just a place. It was an entity, alive and breathing, waiting for the right moment to call her back. But as Sarah ran, she fought to convince herself that it was over. She had escaped, hadn't she? But deep in her gut, she knew the truth. There was no such thing as escape. The further she ran, the more the world around her seemed distorted, as though reality itself had been twisted, warped by the horrors she had just witnessed. The trees, tall and gnarled, seemed to lean toward her, their branches twisting like skeletal hands reaching out. The road stretched before her in a way that felt wrong, too long, too empty. She couldn't see anyone else. No cars, no lights from neighboring houses, just the desolation of the town and the endless whisper of the wind. It was as though the world itself had abandoned her, as if she were the last person left standing. She reached her car, barely noticing the scratches on her arms or the trembling in her fingers as she fumbled for the keys. The door slammed shut behind her, and for a moment, the silence was almost as deafening as the chaos she had just fled. She turned the ignition and heard the engine roar to life. She didn't look back. She couldn't. As she sped down the winding road, the lights from her car barely illuminating the dark path ahead, she couldn't shake the sensation that she was being followed. The shadows clung to her like an illness, pressing against her windows, but when she glanced in the rearview mirror, all she saw was the empty, stretching road behind her. The house was gone, at least in the physical sense. But Sarah knew better. Her reflection in the side mirror flickered. Just for a split second, but it was there. She blinked, shook her head and glanced again. Nothing. Just the road, the trees, the fading light. But that brief moment of unease lingered like a bad taste, an omen. In the days that followed, Sarah tried to put the horrors of that night behind her. She tried to convince herself that it was nothing more than a bad dream, a figment of her imagination driven by fear and exhaustion. She returned to her apartment, but nothing felt the same. The walls of her room seemed to close in on her, the stillness of her surroundings only serving to magnify the dread that had taken root in her mind. Every shadow seemed to move. Every creak in the floorboard seemed like a whisper. She couldn't escape the feeling that the house, the mirror, had followed her home. She tried to distract herself with work, even tried to write her story, but the words wouldn't come. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the mirror, to the reflection of her sister trapped inside it, to the voice that had whispered those chilling words, "It's your fault." But who was to blame? What had she seen? Was it all real, or was it just her mind, unraveling in the face of something too terrifying to comprehend? One evening, as she sat in the dim light of her desk lamp, trying to focus on anything other than the horrors she had witnessed, Sarah caught sight of something in the corner of her eye. Her own reflection. It stood still in the mirror. Her eyes were wide, filled with the same terror she had felt that night, but there was something else, something that made her blood run cold. The reflection was smiling. She turned to face it, her breath catching in her throat. The reflection in the mirror was exactly as it should have been, just Sarah. But it was grinning. Not a smile of relief, not one of comfort, but a twisted, menacing grin that stretched unnaturally wide. Sarah's hands shook as she reached up to touch her own face, but she pulled away immediately as if it were burning. Her heart raced, the sensation of dread creeping back, tightening around her chest. She backed away from the mirror, unable to look away from the malevolent grin that seemed to mock her from within the glass. She just knew, that the mirror was no longer just a reflection. It had become something else, something that was alive, and now it was coming for her. The days that followed were no better. Every time Sarah glanced into a mirror, she couldn't escape the feeling that something was wrong. At night, when she tried to sleep, the reflection in her bedroom mirror would move on its own, as though someone else was standing in her place. The familiar contours of her own face would distort, flickering with strange, unfamiliar shapes. Her heart pounded in her chest as she tried to look away, but no matter where she went, no matter how far she turned her back, it was always there. Watching. Waiting. Days turned into weeks, but Sarah could no longer escape. The curse of the mirror house had followed her, woven itself into the fabric of her reality, and it was only growing stronger. One night, Sarah woke with a start, drenched in sweat. The nightmare had returned. She saw her sister again, trapped inside the mirror, reaching out to her, silent screams echoing in the void. She bolted upright in her bed, gasping for breath, the remnants of the dream clinging to her like a heavy fog. As she sat there in the dark, she felt a chill crawl across her skin. The reflection in the mirror on her dresser shimmered, distorting and stretching. For a brief, horrible moment, Sarah could have sworn that it wasn't her face at all, that it was someone else, someone she didn't recognize. She reached for the lamp, but as her fingers brushed the switch, the reflection in the mirror smiled again. Not her. Something else. Something worse. With a scream that she could feel in her very bones, Sarah turned away. But the reflection stayed. The legend of the mirror house was not just a story. It was a curse. And now Sarah was living it. And so, the story of Sarah and the mirror house ends here, or does it? We've seen the horrors she faced, the reflection that defied logic, and the curse that refused to let go. But what truly happened in that old mansion? Was it merely her imagination unraveling under the weight of fear, or was there something darker at play, something beyond human comprehension? What about the legend? Do you believe that mirrors can capture more than just a reflection? Could Sarah's sister still be trapped, her cries echoing in the void, waiting for someone to free her? Or has the curse already claimed another victim? I want to hear your thoughts. What do you think really happened to Sarah? Could the curse of the mirror house have been avoided, or was she doomed the moment she stepped through its doors? Share your theories, your ideas, and even your own tales of haunted places in the comments below. Your perspective might just shine a light on the shadows surrounding this chilling story. But don't stop here. If you crave more tales that send shivers down your spine, stories that linger in the corners of your mind long after the screen fades to black, then make sure to hit that subscribe button. New stories just like this one are waiting for you every week. And don't forget to turn on notifications, because you don't want to miss your next daily dose of horror, do you? Your support means the world to us and keeps the stories coming. Like this video if it left you questioning what's real and what's not, and share it with someone who loves a good scare. Who knows? Maybe they'll have their own theories about Sarah, the mirror house, and the curse that continues to haunt her. Until next time, remember, some reflections are best left unseen. Sweet dreams.